Following the opening of the IRT subway in 1904, the use of public transportation in New York City started to skyrocket. The ease of paying a few cents to walk into a subway station and take a train to your destination won out against walking or purchasing an automobile and getting stuck in traffic en route to your destination. The subway thrived in performance in its early years, with service being quick and reliable. Actually, in the 1950s, we had better service levels than what we currently have. For example, the 7 currently runs 29 to 30 trains per hour, while in 1950 it ran 37 trains per hour, a dramatic decrease. With the introduction of timer signals and speed caps on trains, speeds have decreased and wait times have increased. In this video, we'll be exploring the decline of the subway system, the late 1900s. This was the turning point for the system, progressing from ancient to modern times. The Transit Authority didn't have much of a chance of surviving well in America's changing beliefs in the 1970s. Only 4 days into the decade, the fare for the subway increased from 20 to 30 cents. While that sounds great compared to the current price of $2.75, 30 cents in 1970 is equivalent to about $2.30 today, and back then, people didn't earn much money. This increase was supposed to plug large holes in service and allow the Transit Authority to repair aging infrastructure. With America's dependence on vehicles growing in the early 1970s and the subway's fare increasing around the same time, people switched to driving as a means of transportation. As less and less people used the subway, crime increased, as there were less people in certain areas, meaning less witnesses. As crime increased, less people used the system. It was a cycle. Trains were covered in graffiti, stations covered in garbage and dust, and the infrastructure was so bad that there were many parts of the system where trains had to slow to 10 miles per hour or less. It was overall a horrible experience to be in the system. Even service during this time decreased, as the Transit Authority saw no reason to run the same levels of service as before the decrease in ridership. In conjunction with the decrease in service, the Transit Authority created a Program for Action plan. Under this plan, a large number of subway lines were closed and service was cut in many sections. One of the biggest casualties of the Program for Action was the Bronx section of the IRT 3rd Avenue Elevated, a line which was intended to be replaced with a Bronx extension of the 2nd Avenue subway. Unfortunately, it never was, and a subway line that could have been incredibly useful today has been lost forever. Another line that was closed because of the Program for Action was the Bmt Jamaica Line between 121st Street and 168th Street. Unlike the IRT 3rd Avenue Elevated though, it was replaced with the BMT Archer Avenue line in the late 1980s. Talking about the 1980s, the R62 through R68A series of trains were delivered during this decade. These cars, being stainless steel, were more reliable and resilient to graffiti. They were easier to clean, and this marked the start of the Transit Authority's efforts to improve the system and bring back those precious riders they lost in the 1970s. In the late 1980s to mid-1990s, the Transit Authority went through GOH, or the General Overhaul Program. This saw the rebuilding of many of the system's SME trains. Trains were repainted, had their braking systems replaced, and more. By the early 90s, most if not all trains were free of graffiti, and ridership started to recover within the system. Things were looking good for the system, but the Transit Authority wasn't going to stop improving. They started to look into modernized trains. In the mid-1990s, the Transit Authority tested out new trains with AC traction motors, automated announcements, and more. We know these trains as the R110A and B series, and they paved the way for the new technology trains we see all across the system today. With that, in an effort to improve safety while riding the subway, the Transit Authority started to crack down on reckless operation. They installed speedometers in all subway cars, timer signals which limited train speeds in certain parts of the system, and introduced speed caps on trains, preventing them from traveling too fast. In the current day, trains have their speeds and acceleration capped so they are safe to operate within our closely spaced signal blocks. If we were to increase the speeds or acceleration of our trains, we would need to modify the signaling system. This can actually be done on CBTC activated lines, since they deal with a moving signal block. Overall, they attempted to improve and turn the subway into a safer place, and they were successful in their attempts. Since then, the system has been in a much better state. Maintenance has improved throughout the numerous yards in the system, rail cars have become much more reliable, and the system as a whole is much cleaner than what it used to be. Despite this though, there are still remnants of the 1900s in the system today, with abandoned stations and graffiti still being present. I recently learned of the story of a graffiti artist who went by the name of Nick707. He was an artist who took his work on the go with himself. He put his works of art on trains as ads, and when he left the subway, he took his graffiti with him. A pop-up exhibit of sorts. Graffiti is usually associated with crime, and while many forms of it are associated with crime, this type of graffiti, leaving no marks on the trains, is one of the better versions of it. It allows for riders to view true artwork while keeping the trains intact. Maybe the MTA can look into more community-driven pieces of art throughout the subway in the future. I think that is what will bring the system to a whole new level. Imagine seeing artwork on the sides of trains instead of the bland, gray stainless steel. If you want to learn more about Nick707 and graffiti in the subway system, I would suggest taking a look at the InstaFame art website, which will be linked in the description below. Anyways, whenever you think the subway is in a bad place currently, think back to this video and remember just how bad it actually used to be. Maybe the subway these days isn't so bad. We might have decreased service from what was here in the mid-1900s, but at least our stations and trains aren't covered in graffiti and literally falling apart. Unless you're looking at the R46s or the Chamber Street station on the Nassau Street line. If so, then what I just said does not apply. If you enjoyed this video and you would like to get more from Mystic Transit, like, subscribe, and consider supporting me via channel memberships or super thanks. Special thanks to the Bronx Express Gaming for supporting me at the train operator tier, and Stuart Guberman and Daniel Green for supporting me at the 2 Broadway tier.